Page 262. That same spring, many Russian emigres were also in those cells. It was very like a dream. The resurrection of buried history, the weighty tones on the Civil War had long since completed and their covers shut tight. The causes for which people fought in it had been decided. The chronology of its events had been set down in textbooks. The leaders of the white movement were, it appeared, no longer our contemporaries on earth, but were mere ghosts of a past that had melted away. The Russian emigres had been more cruelly dispersed than the tribes of Israel, and in our Soviet imagination, if they were still dragging out their lives somewhere, was as pianists in stinking little restaurants, as lackeys, laundresses, beggars, morphine and cocaine addicts, and virtual corpses. Right up until 1941, when the war came, it would have been impossible to find out from any hints in our newspapers, our lofty literature, our criticism of the arts, nor did our own well-fed masters of art and literature help us find out that Russia abroad was a great spiritual world, that in Russian philosophy was living, that in it Russian philosophy was living and developing, that out there were philosophers like Bulgakov, Bridgehead, and Losky, that Russian art had enchanted the world, that Rachmaninoff, Chilipin, Benoit, Diaghilev, Pavlova, and the Don Cossack chorus of Jarov were out there. The profound studies of Dostoevsky were being undertaken at a time when he was anathema in the Soviet Union. That the incredible writer Nabokov Sirin also existed out there. That Bunin himself was still alive and had been writing for all these 20 years. The journals of the arts were being published. That theatrical works were being produced. That Russians from the same areas of Russia came together in groups where their mother tongue could be heard, and that emigre men had not given up marrying emigre women, who in turn presented them with children, which meant young people our own age. The picture of emigration presented in our country was so falsified that if one had conducted a mass survey to ask which side of the Russian emigres were on in the Spanish Civil War, or else perhaps what side were they on in the Second World War, with one voice everyone would have replied, for Franco, for Hitler. Even now, people in our country do not know that many more white emigres fought on the Republican side in Spain, that both the Vlasov divisions and the Cossack Corps of von Panwitz, the Krasnov Corps, were made up of Soviet citizens and not of emigres. The emigres did not support Hitler. They ostracized Merezhkovsky, and Tipiets, who took Hitler's part, leaving them to alienated loneliness. There was a joke, except it wasn't a joke, to the effect that Denikin wanted to fight for the Soviet Union against Hitler, and that at one time Stalin planned to arrange his return to the motherland, not for military reasons, obviously, but as a symbol of national unity. During the German occupation of France, a horde of Russian emigres, young and old, joined the resistance, and after the liberation of Paris, they swarmed to the Soviet embassy to apply for permission to return to the motherland. No matter what kind of Russia it was still Russia. That was their slogan, and that is how they proved they had not been lying previously about their love for her. Imprisoned in 1945-46, they were almost happy that these prison bars and these jailers were their own Russian, and they observed with surprise The Soviet boys scratching their heads and saying, "Why the hell did we come back? Wasn't there enough room for us in Europe?" But given that Stalinist logic, which said that every Soviet person who lived abroad had to be imprisoned in camp, how could the emigres possibly escape the same lot? In the Balkans, Central Europe, Harbin, they were arrested as soon as the Soviet armies arrived. They were arrested in their apartments and on the street, just like Soviet citizens. For a while, state security arrested only men, and not all of them, only those who had, in one or another way, revealed a political bias. Later on, their families were transported to exile in Russia, but some were left where they were in Bulgaria and Czechoslovakia. In France, they were welcomed into Soviet citizenship and with honors and flowers, and sent back to the motherland in comfort. And only then, when they got to the USSR, they were raked in. Things dragged out longer for the Shanghai emigres. In 1945, Russian hands didn't reach that far. But a plenipotentiary from the Soviet government went to Shanghai and announced the decree of the Presidium of the Supreme Soviet, extending forgiveness to all emigres. Well, now, how could one refuse to believe that? The government certainly couldn't lie. Whether or not there actually was such a decree, it did not in any case tie the hands of the organs. The Shanghai Russians expressed their delight. They were told they could take them as many possessions as they wanted, and whatever they wanted. They went home with automobiles and country could put them to good use. They were told they could settle wherever they wanted in the Soviet Union and, of course, work in any profession or trade. They were transported from Shanghai in steamships. The fate of the passengers varied. On some of the ships, for some reason, they were given no food at all. They also suffered various fates after reaching port in Nakotka, which was incidentally one of the main transit centers of Gulag. Almost all of them were loaded in freight cars like prisoners, except that they had, as yet, no strict convoy and there were no police dogs. Some of them were actually delivered to inhabited places, to cities, and allowed to live there for 2 or 3 years. Others were delivered in trainloads straight to their camps and were dumped out somewhere off a high embankment into the forest beyond the Volga, together with their white pianos and their jardinières. In 1948-49, former Far Eastern emigres who had until then managed to stay out of camps were scraped up to the last man. As a 9-year-old boy, I had read the small, dark blue books of V.V. Shogun with more interest, and I had read Jules Verne. At the time, they were sold openly in our bookstalls. It was a voice from a world that had disappeared with such finality that not even the most extravagant fantasy could have projected that invisible point in the soundless corridors of the big Lubyanka, where steps would intersect my own before 20 years had passed. True, I would not meet the man himself until another 20 years had gone by, but I had time to study attentively at many emigres, young and old, in the spring of 1945. I underwent a medical examination with Captain Borsch and Colonel Maryushkin, and the pitiful sight of their naked, wrinkled, dark yellow bodies, not bodies any longer, but mummies, has always remained before my eyes. They were arrested 5 minutes this side of the grave, so to speak, and brought to Moscow from several thousand miles away. And there in Moscow in 1945, an interrogation was proceeding in the most serious way, their struggle against Soviet power in 1919. We have become so used to the piling up of injustices during the interrogation and trial that we have ceased to drawing any distinctions of degree between them. This captain and this colonel were veteran officers of the Tsar's Russian army. They had both been over 40, and they had both served in the army for 20 years. When the telegraph brought them news that the Tsar had been overthrown in Petrograd, for 20 years they had served the Tsar according to their oath, and now, against their wills, for all we know, possibly muttering "beat it, scram" to themselves, they swore loyalty to the provisional government, and that no one asked them to swear any more oaths because the whole army fell apart. They didn't like the new scheme of things, wherein soldiers tore off shoulder boards and officers and killed them, and it was natural for them to join other officers to fight against it, and it was natural for the Red Army to fight against them and push them into the sea. But a country in which at least the rudiments of jurisprudence exist, what basis was there for putting them on trial? And a quarter of a century later at that, they had lived as private persons all that time. Mariushkin, up to the very last moment of his arrest, Borscht, to be sure, had turned up in a Cossack wagon train in Austria, but in a transport with the old men and women, not as an armed unit. However, in 1945, in the very center of Soviet jurisdiction, they were charged with actions directed towards the overthrow of the government of the workers and peasants, the Soviets. Armed incursion into Soviet territory, in other words, not having immediately left Russia when Petrograd was declared Soviet, aiding the international bourgeoisie when they had never seen even in their dreams, serving counter-revolutionary governments, i.e. their own generals, to whom they had been subordinate all their lives. And all of these sections, numbers 1, 2, 4, 13, and Article 58, were included in the Criminal Code, adopted in 1926. That is, 6 to 7 years after the end of the Civil War. This was a classic and so unconscionable example of the ex post facto application of a law. In addition, Article 2 of the Code specified that it applied only to citizens taken in custody on the territory of the Russian Republic. But state security's strong right arm had grabbed these people, who were in no wise Soviet citizens, from all the countries of Europe and Asia. And we won't even bring up the question of statutes and limitations. This question was provided for very flexibly. No statutes of limitations applied to Article 58. Why stir up the past indeed? Such statutes are invoked only in the case of our homegrown executioners, who have destroyed many more of their compatriots than did the whole Civil War. Mariushkin at least remembered everything clearly. He told us the details of being evacuated from Novorossiysk, but Borscht had already descended into his second childhood and prattled on and on about celebrating Easter and Lubyanka. He had eaten only half his bread ration during Palm Sunday week and Holy Week, and had set the rest of it aside, gradually replacing the stale pieces with fresh ones. Thus he accumulated 7 full rations when it came time to break the Lenten fast, and he had feasted for the 3 days of Easter. I do not know what kind of white guards they were in the Civil War, either of them, whether they were among the exceptional few who hung every 10th worker without trial and whipped the peasants, or whether they were the other kind, the soldierly majority. The fact that they were being interrogated and sentenced in Moscow is no proof of anything. nor a matter of any consequence. But if, from that time on, they had lived for a quarter of a century, not as retired officers on pensions and with honor, but as homeless exiles, then how could anyone point to any moral basis for trying them? That is the kind of dialectic Anatole France mastered, but which we cannot seem to grasp. According to Anatole France, by the time it's today, yesterday's martyr is already in the wrong. In fact, from the first minute, the red shirt covered his body, and vice versa. But our version is, if they rode me for 1 short year, when I had just outgrown being a foal, then I am called a riding horse all my life, even though I have long since been used only as a cab horse. Colonel Konstantinovich Yasevich was very different from these helpless emigre mummies. For him, clearly, the end of the Civil War had not ended the struggle against Bolshevism, as to how he continued to struggle, where and with what, he did not enlighten me. But the sense that he was still in the service remained with him in the cell itself, in the midst of all the chaotic concepts, the blurred and broken lines of vision in most of our heads. He had, evidently, a clear and exact view of everything around him. As a result of this reasoned point of view on life, his body, too, exhibited a steady strength, resiliency, and activity. He was certainly not less than 60. His head was totally bald, without a single hair. He had already survived his interrogation and was awaiting his sentence, like the rest of us. He could expect no help from anywhere, of course, but he kept his young, even rosy skin. Among all of us in the cell, he alone did exercises every morning and washed himself at the faucet. The rest of us were trying not to squander these calories in our prison ration. He put his time to use, and whenever an aisle opened up between the rows of board bunks, he paced those 15 to 20 feet with a precise stride and a precise profile, crossing his arms over his chest and staring through the walls with clear young eyes. And the difference between us and him was that we were all astonished at what was happening to us, while nothing around him contradicted his expectations, and precisely for that reason he was absolutely alone in the cell. A year later, I was able to appraise his conduct in prison. Once again, I was in the Buturki. It was one of those 70 cells. I met some young co-defendants of Yasevich who had already been sentenced to 10 and 15 years. Sentences given everyone in their group was typed out on cigarette paper, and for some reason they had it in their possession. Yasevich was first on the list. His sentence was to be shot. So that was what he foresaw through the wall with his still young eyes as he paced back and forth from the table to the door. But his unimpaired consciousness of the correctness of his path in life lent him extraordinary strength. Among the emigres was one of my own age, Igor Trunko. We became friends. Both of us were weak, dried out, and our skin was grayish-yellow on our bones. Why had we collapsed to such an extent? I think the main cause was spiritual confusion. Both of us were thin and on the tall side, and we were shaken by the gusts of summer wind in the Buturki courtyards. We always walked side by side with the careful steps of old men and discussed the parallels in our lives. He had been born in South Russia the same year as I, and we were still nursing babes when fate struck her hand and into her well-worn purse and drew out a short straw for me and a long one for him. So it was that he rolled off across the sea, even though his white guard father was just a rank-and-file, property telegrapher. I found it interesting in the extreme to picture through his life all those compatriots of my generation who had landed outside Russia. They had grown up under good family supervision and in very modest, even meager circumstances. They were all very well brought up within the range of existing possibilities, well educated. They grew up without knowing fear of repression through the white organization, maintained a certain yoke of authority over them until they themselves grew strong. They grew up in such a way that the sins to which all European youth were subject in that period, a high crime rate, a frivolous attitude toward life, thoughtfulness, dissipation, did not touch them. That was because when they grew up, so to speak, in the shadow of the indelible misfortune which had befallen their families, whatever country they grew up in, they looked to Russia. They looked on Russia alone as their motherland. Their spiritual upbringing was based on Russian literature, all the more beloved because to them it was the beginning and the end of their motherland. Because for them, their motherland did not exist as a primary geographical and physical fact. The contemporary printed word was much more generally accessible to them than to us, but they received Soviet books in conspicuously small quantities, and they felt this lack all the more keenly. It seemed to them chiefly responsible for their inability to understand that this was most important, highest, and most beautiful in Soviet Russia, and that the books they did not receive presented a distortion, a lie, were incomplete. The picture they had of our real life was very, very faint, but their longing for the motherland was such that if we had called on them in 1941, they would have all joined the Red Army, and it would have been even sweeter for them to die than to survive. These young people from 25 to 27 already represented and firmly defended several points of view in definite conflict with the opinions of the old generals and political leaders. Thus, Igor's group was called Nepredreshensky, and the non-prejudgers. Igor's group was called the non-prejudgers. They declared that anyone who had not shared with the motherland the whole complex burden of the past decades had no right to decide anything about the future of Russia, nor even to presuppose anything, but should simply go and lend his strength to whatever the people might decide. We would often lie beside one another on the wooden bunks. I tried to understand this world as best I could, and our encounter revealed to me a concept confirmed by later encounters, that the outflow from Russia of a significant part of her spiritual forces, which occurred in the Civil War, had deprived us of a great and important stream of Russian culture. Everyone who really loves that culture will strive for the reunion of both streams, the one at home and the tributary abroad. Only then will our culture attain wholeness. Only then will our culture attain wholeness. Only then will it reveal its capacity for benign development, and I dream of living until that day. Thank you for listening.